Thank you very much for the invitation. And I assume you can see the slides. If not, I appreciate if you let me know.
Yes. Yes.
So the question that this paper asks is a positive question. It asks like, what would have been the path of bond yield spreads in Spain without fiscal austerity during this 4-year time window? And how does Diego tackle the question? He says, he asks first, he poses first like a Newton-Gersowitz sovereign default model. This is a very nice feature because there's going to be endogenous incentives to default and the spread is going to be endogenous. He assumes a flexible yet exogenous fiscal policy behavior with shocks. And this has the advantage that it closely traces the observed fiscal policy, the debt in particular. And it also helps in the identification of the magnitude of austerity policies. So austerity here means a deviation from business as usual for fiscal policy. And the third key ingredient here is the presence of wage rigidities, lump sum taxes, and I would say lack of wealth effects on labor issue decisions. So this generates an endogenous multiplier, and the multiplier is positive because taxes are not distortionary. So austerity that leads to lower taxes eventually would not induce higher labor supply. And this plays a role here in a usual narrative that we heard about that time. So the trade-off that he's asking in this paper is like, well, it's true that the spread may fall if fiscal austerity lowers the probability of a default, but austerity also may be bad for the economy, may lower GDP, and that may increase incentive to default down the road. So what is the result of this horse race between these two effects? So the summary of the result is this. I will summarize it in this graph. So the left graph has austerity implied by the model with austerity, and the dashed red line is the model without austerity. So he identifies the shocks to government expenditures, shuts them off, and asks, well, what would have happened without those shocks? On this graph, I plotted the German spread 10-year bond yield. It has like a clever way of disciplining the spread. So he uses like 0 coupon bonds and computes what would be the spread observing the data of the bonds that Diego assumes in the paper. So this is different from the spread that I picked up from the data, but the model anyway does like a very good job in mimicking the spread dynamics. This is a model with long-term debt. So at some point, agents are not surprised by this spike in the spread. So the spread is positive, usually is positive. Here is above 1%. In the data was 0 before 2010, but I don't think there's much that we can do about it. And then he presents this robustness. So the exercise is done for Spain, but this has like a broader message, and it's encompassed in this graph. So what does he do? He varies a fiscal rule, the borrowing rule, so that the model can generate different levels of fiscal multipliers. And on the vertical axis, he says, oh, what is the ex-ante probability that we can see austerity increasing the spread? That the fiscal multiplier would be so high that austerity would depress economic activity, would increase default incentives, and lead to a higher spread. And the message is that, well, you need really high multipliers for that to happen, and when it's going to happen with very low frequency in addition to that. At most, like it's going to happen with like less than 10%, even for multipliers as high as like above 3. I really enjoy reading the paper. It's like very clear. The execution like is very nice. He also does like a very good analytical analysis. So this is not a model that amenable to analytics, but he's very careful with that. And it shows that he thought about different angles of this measurement problem. And allowing for multipliers effect of fiscal policy is like a very nice step in the, and it goes in the right direction. This adds to a growing literature. There's a paper that Ignacio, Javier, and Pablo wrote, and Ignacio is an excellent choice of discussant, and I'm happy to endow him some time. There's a former Indiana student that also had like a paper with in a similar line. And there are earlier papers by Enrique Mendoza, Vivian Yuen, and more recent by Arellano, Valle, and Bocola, in which there's another sort of multiplier channel. Government, by affecting the sovereign spread, this affects the borrowing cost for private agents, and that can have also another effect on GDP. So I'm gonna structure my main comments. They're gonna assume like that they're gonna be about the assumed fiscal behavior, the role of government expenditures, and the use of Spain as a case study. So Diego assumes that government expenditures follow this process. And he estimates that this the sensitivity of current government expenditures to lag GDP and to lag debt is nearly zero. So it's basically an autoregressive process with a persistence of 95. And austerity here is some accumulation of negative innovations to government expenditures. It doesn't need to be negative in every period of in every period of the time window, because there is persistence. So there may be some positive that undo part of initial positive shocks that undo part of initial negative shocks. And the debt level follows this process without shocks, as Cesar pointed out. But this shock to government expenditure impacts borrowing because it affects and it has this sensitivity. So current borrowing has this elasticity to current government expenditures. This is estimated to be 0.13. So what happens here with taxes, there's a lump sum tax in the economy, and lump sum taxes adjust according to the budget constraint. They are residual. So this assumed fiscal behavior, like this is useful in it has been useful in the literature, especially in the empirical literature, to identify fiscal shocks and thus to measure multipliers, because like lag variables are predetermined. So that helps in the identification of shocks. If you think about fiscal austerity programs, this is like typically structured like as a decrease in G or an increase in taxes for a finite number of periods. And this formulation that is studied in the paper, this assumes that these innovations are uncorrelated over time. So when a fiscal austerity program is implemented, so we can think that, okay, so this shock maybe lasts for longer, or maybe this rho may capture some of that. But as soon as austerity is done, I guess from anecdotal evidence, governments go back to normal, so we can expect that these epsilons to be positive at some point in time. So this may be an issue to think about this measurement of the spread. So the spread here, Diego assumes long-term debt, and I think that's like a right assumption. So the spread that he estimates depends on not only on what the government is doing today, but what the government is expected to do in the future. And this the finite aspect of austerity may be important for that. Another is how to think about the shocks. So this is like austerity here means like a deviation from business as usual. Is this like a plausible representation of a fiscal policy during crisis? Is there something like more changes in the structure of in this inherent persistence of government expenditures, for instance, or how the government reacts to endowment shocks or income shocks, sorry. So maybe usually the government doesn't react to shocks most of the time, and that we get an estimate of 0, but in times of crisis, maybe these shocks matter for fiscal policy, and we are missing that with this with representation. So an alternative is to model it as an endogenized G, as Ignacio and co-authors do in the paper, perhaps with a lag, as is assumed here. And then he can estimate, in such a model, he could estimate the effect of deviations of government, estimated deviations of government expenditures on the spread, and maybe evaluate anticipated changes in government expenditures. So in order to endogenize it, some other assumption here that is going to get in the way, and this is like that Diego assumes that G is wasteful spending, so this is not much relevant for the positive exercise, and it doesn't matter for the multiplier effect. So here austerity is bad for the economy because austerity makes the tradable good more scarce. The government borrows less from foreign markets, so it brings less bananas to the economy, banana being tradable. So this makes a tradable good more valuable, which depresses the price of a non-tradable good. A lower price of a non-tradable goods induces firms in the non-tradable sector to try to adjust and hire less workers, and the downward wage rigidity means that the adjustment is going to be on the quantity and not on wages. So absent wage rigidity, here austerity would be good for welfare because it would increase the resources available for private consumption. So we think about what would be the optimal G without austerity. Here, well, it should be 0 because it's G just destroys goods in the economy that are valuable for consumption. But the paper focuses on positive implications of what would be the effect on the spread, but the spread depends also on the difference in continuation value. So there's some welfare channel that affects the spread. How much does it affect it? I don't know. Perhaps not much, but that's something to think about. So I'm gonna go back to this paper by Ignacio. They assume that the government expenditures have social value, and I think also this is like a nice positive exercise. But if we want to think about how do we move forward with this exercise, okay, what do we do with this estimate of the elasticity of fiscal policy on the spread? Well, the model, this fiscal rules gets in the way of thinking about what would be the good design of fiscal austerity programs, for instance. So endogenizing fiscal policy would be a nice forward. So Diego uses Spain as a case study. And this is like a sort of like a sexy case because everybody was talking about Europe. But there's just a very narrow window of time where there was action in Spain and many European countries. And many things were going on at this time. So there was uncertainty about bailout policies. There's monetary policy that play a role, and so on and so forth. So how much can we capture the role of fiscal policy, the role of fiscal policy and other fundamentals on the spread when there is such a very narrow window of time where there is action? And Diego has like a very clever graph in the paper that I guess illustrates like a similar point. Another way of complementing the analysis is to use like
Juan Carlos,
yes.
You have just 1 minute left.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you.
An event study with, okay, what happened to the spread after announcements, that could shed light on this elasticity and the effect on austerity. So Diego could use other countries as well. So I guess most of us come from emerging economies, and with there are many examples with a lot of variation in sovereign spread. So this peak of 5% in Spain, this is a good day in Argentina. So in my last 3 seconds, I'll go back to this quote by this paper by Alessina and Ardaña. So they say that if agents believe that stabilization austerity is credible and avoids the default, they go a default on government debt, then the agents can ask for a lower premium of government bonds. So private demand components sensitive to the real interest rate can increase the reduction in interest rate paid on government bonds, so reduction in real interest rate charged on consumers and debt, and that may have positive effects on the economy. So this is like a nice motivation for the exercise conducted in the paper, and also suggest thinking about what would happen if we allow for, this is not a channel allowed in this paper, but this is something that other papers have done, and there are easy ways of doing it. Thank you very much.